In this section of muscle tissue, we're going to talk about the really small parts of the muscle cell. Some new parts that you probably never heard of because muscle cells, as we said, unlike any other cell in the body, can contract or get smaller, producing force to pull on bones. And to do so, they have to have a very special microanatomy. So let's take apart an individual muscle cell. We can tell this is a muscle cell because we can see that this covering of it is the muscle cell membrane. We can see that it's a single muscle cell because it definitely is an object that has nuclei within it. So there are several places that we can see a nucleus in this structure, and only cells have a nucleus in it. So a nucleus is one of the organelles within a cell. And so this cell has many nuclei, and that tells us it's a skeletal muscle cell. We also know skeletal muscle cells are very long and thin, and certainly this cell seems fairly long and thin, even though we're just seeing one part of this muscle cell. It looks like it's been cut off over here. So this is the muscle cell membrane, also sometimes called the sarcolemma. The sarcolemma. So you might see that in your book. The word sarco, or the prefix sarco, means muscle as well. So just like the terms myo means muscle, and the terms mys means muscle, the word sarco also means muscle. So let's take a look inside the sarcolemma. Pulling it back, we can see that there's a number of structures within there, and we've seen these before. They are the long, skinny organelles inside a muscle cell called myofibrils. Myofibrils. There's that word myo again. M-Y-O, fibril. The term myo, of course, meaning muscle, and fibril meaning long and skinny, and that is a good definition for what this looks like. These myofibrils are bundled up together, lying next to each other, and they are surrounded by another structure which looks kind of like a meshwork of something. So this blue meshwork here, connected to a big, long blue tube, this entire structure is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Sarcoplasmic reticulum. So sarcoplasmic reticulum. A reticulum is a network, kind of like if you were looking at a subway map of New York City, it might look something like this. And it is a network of tubes, and these tubes are filled with the element calcium, the calcium ions. They're kind of in a liquid form, floating around inside the tube, and these tubes are connected to a larger tube on the edge, which is sometimes called the terminal cistern. The word terminal means end, and this is definitely the end of this particular object, the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and a cistern is like a bucket that holds a fluid. So this is definitely holding that liquid calcium. And the sarcoplasmic reticulum, this entire blue structure, surrounds the myofibril. In fact, you can see the little blue ends here of the tubes as they surround the myofibril. So if the myofibril was somebody's arm and somebody was wearing a crocheted sweater, the sweater would go all the way around the arm. And this particular organelle, the sarcoplasmic reticulum, will be important because it contains the calcium necessary for contraction. Now, the calcium is stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum until it's needed, and then it's going to be released, and it's going to rain down on the adjacent myofibril. So the myofibril is surrounded by the sarcoplasmic reticulum because the calcium provided by the SR is going to leak inside the myofibril here. There's a few other organelles you might recognize in here from other classes. Definitely muscle cells have mitochondria. Mitochondria are what we call the powerhouse of the cell. In other words, they can manufacture ATP. So they take energy from food and they transfer it into the molecule ATP, which can be used around the cell to contribute energy to various processes, like the process of contraction. It definitely takes energy to move, and so that energy is provided by the food you eat, and that energy is first put into the mitochondria in terms of ATP, and then ATP is spent kind of like cash around the cell. Anytime you need energy, ATP molecules basically are broken and the energy released in a very simplistic term way of looking at it, and that energy is used for things in the cell. So in this particular picture, we now have seen the sarcolemma, we have seen the myofibrils, we have seen the sarcoplasmic reticulum, its tubular networks with the terminal cistern at the end of them. And we can see that there's many sarcoplasmic reticulum along the myofibril, but between them is one more organelle I'd like to talk about, which is the T-tubule. That is this purple tube right here that lies between the two adjacent sarcoplasmic reticulum. In fact, it's such a striking arrangement here of terminal cistern, T-tubule, terminal cistern, that some people have named it the triad, meaning three things lying next to each other. And so here we can see terminal cistern lying next to the T-tubule. You might not be able to see this, but on the surface of the sarcolemma, we can see a bunch of openings, little tiny, tiny openings, so small that maybe just an ant could go through them if it was to scale. And these tiny openings are the openings of the T-tubules. In other words, the T-tubules go across the entire cell. Here we can see it going from one side to the other. And there's a little opening from one side to the other. So if you were an ant and you were walking across here, you would actually fall in and fall all the way through the T-tubules to the other side. In other words, these T-tubules are passageways through the cell. And they're going to be used to pass electrical current through the cell. And you can see that there's so many of them that the cell can become electrified in its entirety. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. The last thing I'd like to mention from this picture, I know we're spending a lot of time on it, are the inside of the myofibril. So if we look very closely to myofibril, we can see that it's made up of smaller structures still. So looking in here, we can see sort of blue and red dots. And if we pull those blue and red dots, they pull out like little pieces of spaghetti out of a spaghetti package. And we can see that the thin strands here are called myofilaments. Myo meaning what? That's right, we said that myo meant muscle, just like sarco and mys, and filament meaning something long and skinny, just like the word fibril. So inside, arranged in a beautiful sort of geometric pattern inside the myofibril are many myofilaments. Some of them are thin and some of them are thick, so we call them thick myofilaments and thin myofilaments. Sometimes we leave off the word myo and just call them thin and thick filaments. So I'm not sure what your particular book does, but they can be called either thin myofilaments or thin filaments or thick myofilaments or thick filaments, and that is basically the same thing. They are a very, very small part of the muscle cell, but as we'll find out, it is these myofilaments that control contraction. So in a few minutes, we'll go on and we'll talk about all these different parts and how they relate to making the cell smaller.